Sorry about that. I think that's embarrassing. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We are going to get started right now. Thank you so much for making time this evening. We're going to be talking through a couple initiatives that affect parking requirements in the city of Tucson. I'll be taking us through a presentation, and in a couple minutes, I'll give everybody a chance to introduce themselves. But just to get us on the same track for the topic tonight, the initiatives that we're going to talk through are one, preparing the city to be ready for electric vehicles as they become more viable options in the very near future. And two, continuing the restaurant expansion program that gives flexibility to restaurants and bars to repurpose outdoor areas like parking lots for people to enjoy. We're combining these initiatives because they will affect the same part of Tucson's unified development code, namely the parking requirements or the amount and type of parking required depending on the location. Also, these initiatives share some of the same themes, reconsidering space used for parking in light of climate change, as well as opportunities to support local businesses and communities. So we're going to approach these areas one at a time in their own sections with time for discussion in between. But first, let's do some brief introductions. This is a good size group for that. I'll go through the list I have here. If you'd like to say your name and either your affiliation or what brings you to the meeting today, maybe what topic or both that you're most interested in. I'll start with myself and my teammates here. My name is Acacia Dupier. I'm a planner with the City of Tucson Planning and Development Services. And I'll pick Corin to introduce herself next.
Sorry. Thanks, Acacia. Hi, everyone. I'm Corin Manning, Planning Administrator with City of Tucson Planning and Development Services. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Dan?
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Acacia. Dan Bursick, Planning and Development Services. I'm a planner as well. Thanks for being here.
Maria? We'll come back to you, Maria. Maria will also be providing Spanish interpretation if anybody needs that tonight. Maybe you could mention that in your introduction. Next up, let me call out Nick Martel.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Nick Martel, also a planner with the Planning and Development Services.
Great, thank you. I'll keep going down the list here. Alice Rowe.
I'm Alice Rowe. I come from the Blenman Elm neighborhood.
Thank you. Beth Grindle.
Beth Grindell. I'm a member of TRIG and interested in the restaurant patio expansion topic.
Thank you. Antonio Ramirez.
Hello, I'm Antonio Ramirez. I am the communications director for Ward 1, and I'm here with Sinai, my little baby girl.
Hi, guys. That's great. Thanks for being here. I'll continue down the list. Bo Yang.
Well, thank you, Acacia. This is Bo Yang. I teach in the School of Landscape Architecture and Planning at the U of A. And my main interest here is to gather information, latest development from the City of Tucson to help my students get to know the cutting edge. And our studio projects right now actually getting help from Acacia, Dan, and Corin on planning design of the EVSE project here in Tucson. We have a few project sites. Students are working on the design, wayfinding, signage, simulation, shade, and we have also a rubric develop that's also online. We have an online version we want to share with you all as well to get some input. So really happy to be here. Thank you all.
Thank you. Barbara Warren? I'll keep going down the line. Camilla?
This is Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
Sorry, I've got to turn on my other computer. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. I was trying to get onto a computer where I had a mic. I'm the Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Arizona's chapter, and an Eevee driver. And we are very, very interested in promoting clean, safe, renewable energy, including the transportation system, electric vehicles.
Great, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next on my list is Bruce Plank.
Hi there. I'm sorry I just joined a little bit late. I'm an Eevee driver. I'm a solar advocate, and I'm encouraged by what I see happening to make electric vehicles more likely to be more widespread within the city. So I'm supportive of any efforts on the city's part to make it easier for people to have EVs and to charge them in a lot of places.
Thanks. Next on my list is Colette.
I'm Colette Altaffer. I'm a community advocate and a member of TRIG.
Thank you. I see Georgia Pennington. Hi, Georgia.
Hi, I'm Georgia Pennington. I'm a planner with the City of Tucson.
Next, I see Jan Mulder.
Hi, Jan Mulder. I'm a neighbor in Armory Park.
Hi, thank you. Kim Bellis.
Hi, I'm Kim Bellis. I'm with Forge Architecture, and I've been one of the architects working on the Studeries design for the guidelines. Thank you.
Thanks. Logan Havens.
I'm Logan Havens. I live up in Feldman's and just participating because equitable use of public space is something I care about.
Great, thanks. I see Luciana.
Hi, I'm here for a class participation.
Great. Marilyn Robinson.
I'm Marilyn Robinson. I'm representing the Blenman Elm neighborhood on the stakeholder group for the restaurant bar patio expansion.
Thank you. Matt Kopek.
Hi, I'm Matt Kopek. I'm a council aide at the Ward 3 Council Office.
Great. Patricia Schwartz.
Hello, Patricia Schwartz. I work with Living Streets Alliance and also am on the Planning Commission.
Rob Elias.
Hi, everybody. Rob Elias, President and CEO of Tucson Hispanic Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you. I see Sonia here. Sonia, are you there? All right, next on my list is Sophia.
Hi, I'm Sophia Gonzalez. I work with LSA, Living Streets Alliance, and then also I'm the Ward 1 representative for the Bicycle Advisory Committee.
Great, thanks. Did I miss anybody? I went through on my list here. If anybody else would like to say their name and what they're interested in.
Camila Martins-Beckott. I work for Tucson Electric Power and I work on implementing our electric vehicle strategies. So happy to see this happening and looking to see how we can collaborate.
Great, thanks so much for being here.
Hello, everyone. This is Shujuan Li, Associate Professor from the School of Landscape Architecture and Planning at the University of Arizona. My research team and we are working on a research project about the accessibility of public available charging station and the EV adoption in Arizona. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay.
So, Acacia, can you hear me now?
Hey, Maria.
Yeah. I'm gonna offer the Spanish interpretation of this meeting. So if you guys just give me a second to say it in Spanish. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es María Galloso, soy una planeadora urbana en el Departamento de Planeación y Servicios al Desarrollo del Gobierno de la Ciudad de Tucson. Gracias por asistir a esta reunión donde se van a discutir los temas de la preparación para la carga de vehículos eléctricos y también para la expansión de los patios de restaurantes y bares y las modificaciones que se requerirían en los códigos para regular estos cambios. Si hay alguien aquí que va a requerir esta reunión que sea interpretada al español, por favor hágamelo saber ahora. And I'm just waiting for a few seconds if somebody is requesting the interpretation to Spanish. And it doesn't seem like we need the interpretation tonight. Si cambian de opinión, hágamelo saber, ¿ok? Gracias. I think we're ready, Acacia.
Thank you so much, Maria. Appreciate it. And thanks, everyone. Thank you again for your time and for joining us tonight. So we'll jump right into the electric vehicle or EV topic. This has been a focus of our city for some time as one response to climate change and meeting the growing technology and interest for electric vehicles. We want to know how the city can support and encourage EVs in several ways and at several levels. The mayor and city council adopted the EV roadmap back in April of this year to break this goal into smaller steps that each area of the city can focus on. The longer list of tasks includes some pretty visible achievements. For example, the new electric buses you may have seen around town. But specifically, our team at Planning and Development is tasked with proposing the right regulations for new construction to include EV charging right now. In June, it was passed that new 1- and 2-family homes will have to include EV chargers when they're built. And so next for consideration is what kind of commercial and multifamily apartments should include chargers. What kind should they be and how many should there be? So that's what we'll talk about with you tonight. And just for some background here, reviewing some trends in the market and in EV ownership, we are seeing a sort of tipping point in technology, availability, and interest that's really taking off in comparison to previous years. As of last year, there were more than 1.8 million electric vehicles registered in the United States, and it's estimated that by 2030, there will be 18.7 million as sales continue to grow. Also, an interesting note is that although EVs have held a small but growing share of new car sales, recently those sales have been growing while conventional light-duty cars were down last year. Supporting those EV sales are the increased numbers of model availability on the market. We're going from seeing around 50 options today to about 130 models expected in the next few years. So that availability, that visibility, and the investment at the private and government sector levels may be contributing to growing interest because 39% of Americans say they may seriously consider electric for their next vehicle purchase. And we have some understanding of EV adoption numbers here in the Tucson area. If we include zip codes that are within a 1-hour drive of Tucson, about 1 in every 300 vehicles registered is an EV. So this map shows that concentration, that darkest part of the city area. Those EVs are in some of the low density residential communities in the north. For example, in the Catalina foothills, where 1% of all registered vehicles are electric. So something to keep in mind is that the city supports equitable access to EV resources and infrastructure. And while currently it's likely that higher income areas and families have access to both new vehicles and the means to charge them, but as EVs become more available and more affordable, access to places to charge them should be available and affordable. And so that's why including charging at apartment buildings and publicly accessible places like commercial areas, like we're talking about tonight, is an important balance to get right. And just for a little more detail, more context, we have a breakdown of some of the most common models of EVs in the Tucson metro area. The Tesla Model 3 and the Nissan Leaf are the most popular models locally, suggesting that more affordable models are doing well in the area. And as a sort of proxy for recent sales, newer model years are shown here in the chart to the right, where there are more EV models from 2018 in recent years than models from 2017 and older. And so as we think about how much EV readiness, how much EV charging should be included in apartments and commercial areas, these are the different levels of charging infrastructure that can be included at the construction phase. And this is how it will be defined in the regulations. In their own regulatory category, incentives might involve trade-offs in minimum parking requirements. Tucson has this incentive right now. EV charging is not required in commercial areas, but if a developer includes it, they get the trade-off of building less parking. It hasn't been taken advantage very much though. So then going from left to right, from low to high in cost, of course, but also how actually ready each of these definitions will be when construction is finished. EV capable here in light green is the lowest requirement, essentially saying that some spaces need to be pre-wired, but ready for upgrade in the future. It's the cheapest now, but saves someone from coming back and trenching the ground to add wires later. EV ready is the next up, and it's just that. In addition to the wiring, a usable plug is installed during construction. It costs a little bit more than the wires, and it's ready to use. And then on the right, the EV charging stations are the most expensive thing to include, where an actual charging station that allows for payment and metering is installed during construction. So with the help of a consultant, we've been able to understand what other cities are doing, how much of these levels they've turned into requirements. And we're all kind of contemporary working on these at the same time. All these examples are quite recent. A few are listed here in a kind of range from conservative to ambitious on your screen from left to right. And these graphics represent the percentage and type of EV infrastructure in each place. So just looking at Albuquerque, they have both a parking reduction incentive for new development, and they require EV charging stations for 2% of parking spaces in a lot if the lot's bigger than 200. They had some early concern about development costs, which pushed them to focus on this larger size development threshold. They also found that incentives were really only appealing to larger developments rather than smaller ones. Miami-Dade in Florida is interesting because of its stages approach. They require 10% of spaces in new apartment parking lots to be level 2 EV ready through the end of this year. And they bump up to 20% of parking spaces going forward. And at the strictest levels, Salt Lake City, Utah, and San Jose, California have requirements for stations to be installed in construction. San Jose in particular, California in general, is where a substantial amount of EV growth and investment is happening. So right now at new apartments and hotels, every space has to have some kind of EV infrastructure included. Even in the future, the pre-wired spaces could get upgraded and the whole lot would be full of EV charging capability. There in commercial parking lots, a little bit different context, half of all the parking spaces could be upgraded eventually. So based on these examples and additional research, we have 3 potential scenarios to kind of guide this discussion, 3 options of EV requirement intensity to consider for Tucson. The most conservative requires just 25% total readiness in multifamily, with a breakdown of 5% stations, 20% EV ready, and no pre-wiring. In commercial settings, in this conservative scenario, just 10% of spaces are to be EV plug-in ready. Middle of the line, a middle case scenario would require more total readiness in multifamily at 50% of all spaces in a lot being somewhat, having some EV infrastructure. That could be 5% stations, 20% ready, and 25% pre-wired. Commercial would only require 5% stations and 20% ready in this scenario. And then kind of taking a cue from San Jose, the most ambitious scenario would require that 100% of spaces would have some kind of readiness in multifamily development and 50% in commercial. These set the majority of spaces to be pre-wired capable with fewer EV ready and EV stations. So all three of these scenarios tend to focus more requirements on apartments than commercial use, and they put higher percentages within the lots on the lower investment levels of pre-wiring and plug-in ready. So to get the discussion going, we'd like to ask some questions of the group. Let's start off with what has been your experience with EV charging, and you can feel free to add comments in the chat or unmute yourself.
Well, this is Bruce Plank. I'll say something. I live in a single family house, and I recently put in a 220 outlet in my house at the same time that we're doing some other electrical work. And I don't have a EV charging unit. I just have the plug, the 220 plug that's like an oven plug or a dryer plug. That works fine for charging my car, and basically it essentially costs nothing. So I can't see any reason at all that in multifamily housing that every parking space shouldn't at least have that kind of a plug. And I'm not sure what percentage I think would be appropriate for commercial stuff, but my experience at home has made it abundantly clear that it's both cheap and simple to do it. In terms of seeing more public places, I think one question is whether the EV charging that we're talking about in commercial places deals with the question of EV parking only at those charging places and how to deal with time limitations. And I'm not sure I know what the other cities have done about that, but that always seems to be an issue. With regard to my experience in dealing with commercial EV charging around town, I think that there's definitely an issue with maintaining the chargers. And I think installing them is a great start, but there needs to be some discussion about maintaining the chargers if the charging units, in other words, more than just the plug, is put in, if there are charging units where there's a pay piece involved, because many of the older chargers around town don't work. And if the idea for the commercial operations is that people that were customers or people that are doing business nearby were going to actually use those chargers, there needs to be some kind of either commitment or arrangement for them to work. But that's my 2 cents.
Great, thank you, Bruce. Appreciate those comments.
Hey, Acacia, this is Rob from Tucson Hispanic Chamber. Would the city or anybody included be open to having more dialogue with organizations like Blink or Tesla, and what that partnership looks like as far as revenue share, or could a builder install or have a partnership with those organizations as well to make up for some of this planning?
Do you mean like in terms of incentives or offsetting some of the infrastructure?
Yeah, like would it qualify as for offsetting?
Yeah, I think we are open to that. We've had representation from Tesla in some other meetings, so they're definitely engaged. We also know that currently TEP runs incentive programs depending on site context. So yeah, it's definitely, there's room for that.
This is Bruce Plank. Can I just jump in and say one thing to make sure everybody knows, and that is that unfortunately at the moment, the different chargers for different cars are not compatible. So I can't use a Tesla charger with my Nissan Leaf. And so I would be pretty adamantly opposed to the cities in any way subsidizing charging stations that, or even cost sharing if they were only for Teslas. And I think that at some point, I think that's going to get sorted out. But in the short run, I think that's a really important consideration for particularly for people who are buying either used or cheaper EVs, not Teslas. Having a bank of Tesla chargers at a commercial place, which you see at a number of the hotels around town, doesn't do me a bit of good and doesn't do anybody except Tesla owners any good at all.
Thanks, Bruce. Camila, I saw you were going to clarify something.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. I just wanted to maybe get to Rob's question around the revenue sharing thing. So if you put Tesla aside, right, if you go to any charging station, say an Eevee Go or an NL charging station, if it's set up for payment, right, like if it's something that they charge for, that pricing structure is set up by the owner of the charger. So for example, the chargers that TEP owns in front of the our headquarters, it's a complimentary service to the public. In another scenario, the same chargers might be priced at, say, a per minute kind of pricing structure, or it might be a per kWh pricing structure. So all those parking structures are payment structures are different depending on who actually owns the stations. And some set it up so that it's just a pass through in terms of the cost. So they're just directly passing the cost onto the customer. Or some of those scenarios are a premium where they charge an upcharge on top of whatever the cost of the electricity is. But kind of on the multifamily scenario, I think one of the things that we need to think about, particularly in Tucson, is looking at segments of the population that tend to live in multi-unit dwellings and really trying to identify and minimize the cost that might get passed through to those renters. As I would, venture to say that some of the multifamily unit dwellings in Tucson tend to be more for limited income individuals. And so I would just want to ensure that whatever multifamily parking requirement, EV parking requirement or EV station requirement, that we keep in mind that, there are certain segments of the population that won't be adopting electric vehicles in kind of this first round. And what I mean by first round is like when the vast majority of the models are new. I think that in Tucson, a lot of people tend to purchase used vehicles. And so I think we'll see adoption in electric vehicles in Tucson really tick up when there's a robust used electric vehicle market.
Great, thank you for that. I wonder if anybody has some feedback or responses to the idea of what kind of locations besides apartment, multi-family housing, different kind of retail, the amount of time people spend at different types of retail.
This is Barbara. I would say it's an obvious shopping malls and restaurants, places where people are going to be spending some time and will have the benefit of charging over some time. Another question I had, would be level 2 chargers or would there be level 3 chargers? I missed that.
Sure, that's definitely a detail that would need to be worked out. In general, we've seen level 2 be kind of the minimum in like our peer cities research. That is also the current requirement in 1 and 2 family housing, or 1 and 2 family housing. So we've kind of been hovering around at least level 2.
And for travelers from out of town, we may need level 3. Like if we want to go to Phoenix, we need level 3 chargers.
Yes, that's definitely worth considering, yes.
So I know, hey, this is Camila again. And I know that this is in a different part of the code, but I think something that's missing from the list to question number 2 is right-of-way charging. I think particularly when you're looking at multifamily housing units, while you may, there may be an opportunity to like combine, on-site charging infrastructure with right-of-way charging infrastructure. And so I would just want us to think about that as a collective solution and not leave that as an aside for whatever code that impacts.
Thanks, Camilla. And yeah, I just want to jump in and add to that. And in response to Barbara's question, I want to just go back to something Acacia shared at the beginning of this, which is the larger citywide Eevee roadmap. So I just want to highlight that this code change we're talking about would apply only to private sites and is really about minimum standards. But this is part of a much more cohesive approach as a city to developing our Eevee infrastructure. And this is just one piece of the puzzle. And to your point about level 3 infrastructure, Barbara, we definitely want to look for ways to incentivize that. And we're also looking at ways to create more EV charging in our right-of-way. Our Department of Transportation is working on that aspect. We're talking about specifically changes to the development code so that new development on private sites would be required to create some, add some minimum infrastructure around EV charging. So we're really talking about what should be the floor, what should be the minimum. That's not to say that some people will want to go beyond that. Whether it's for, their marketing, for the types of tenants they want to recruit to an office or to a residential development. But what we're trying to narrow in on is what is appropriate as the minimum moving forward. And I just want to highlight that there is a larger conversation about those other pieces in the right-of-way. So we're absolutely thinking about that and how to incentivize that.
One thing I would suggest, if you haven't already, and perhaps you have, would be to talk to places that have had commercial entities, not newly built, but commercial entities that have had EV chargers in place for a long time. The two I can think of quickly are Bookman's, which has had chargers for many years, and Antigone Books and Skybar on 4th Avenue. They're both, all of those are commercial establishments. And I think part of the question we're getting to is how are they being used and where are they placed and what could we learn from those commercial operations that have had chargers available. That it doesn't answer the question obviously about apartment housing, but I think it may be helpful in terms of thinking about restaurants, for example, or other retail places, but they've all had chargers in place for a while.
Great, thanks Bruce, and thanks Corin for adding that context. So the other two questions that we've got here to encourage discussion, just where on that scale from conservative to ambitious should Tucson set itself? And hand in hand in that, what other things do we need to consider to make sure this kind of code amendment benefits all of Tucson?
I wish there was an easy answer to those questions. There's so much to go into those. I think that, as mentioned before, this is part of a much bigger discussion that needs to be had, not just for serving the electric vehicle drivers that we have in the city now, but also someone referenced earlier, the visitors that come to Tucson. And not just that, but what the message tells, what the story tells of us being prepared to accept future businesses that may be wanting to move to Tucson. Maybe this is a part of the narrative that that people will want to see when they move to Tucson, or maybe possibly relocating their business to Tucson, is our value set around whether it be sustainability, whether it be around physical fitness with all the bike paths. It could be a number of things, but I think it's an important discussion to have.
Great, thank you.
This is Barbara. Maybe it might be worth taking a look at how Eevee sales are going and with the different auto distributors here in this community to see if there's a greater need. Although when people buy a car, they're probably going to have chargers in their homes, but it also, something we all would really much appreciate the convenience of being able to go further and longer without concern of losing our charge in our community. So I think looking at where's the demand coming from in terms of the vehicles themselves. How is that growing?
I also have a question with regards to the other cities that you mentioned. I know you said earlier that Tucson has about 1 in 300 cars as electric vehicle. Did I have that? Did I hear that right?
That yes, depending on where in the city,
right,
those registrations are
so
localized.
With those other cities that you referenced in the presentation, what was their, like, what is the tipping point before they added major infrastructure changes to accommodate for electric vehicle charging? Was it 1 in 400? Was it 1 in 300? Was it 1 in 200? I think having some context to that might be helpful as well.
Sure, definitely. California is there on that ambitious side, and that kind of matches the interest there. Arizona is kind of shining through as a state with kind of in the top 6 of EV ownership. So it's something to take serious locally. I see a few hands up here. Logan, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I guess one of my thoughts are that, like, Biden talking about 50% of EV sales being, or car sales being EV by 2030. And the idea that if we're making these requirements for projects, this isn't citywide, this is for this is citywide, but it's for new build projects, correct? Not retrofitting something. So I guess my thought would be it's going to be like a slow trickle to get these EV stations built because of the amount of development we have in the city. And so my thoughts would be, and back to the comment on multifamily, I think our city really devalues multifamily. And so wealthy people don't live in multifamily as often, the kinds of people that are adopting the cars earlier. So I guess my thought would be maybe it's more conservative, EV ready for multifamily housing, but more aggressive with commercial, just because by 2030, by 2040, by 2050, it would just be a shame to not be prepared for the amount of electric vehicles we might have, because the implementation will take a period of time if my observations of how things go generally are correct.
Yeah, those are great points, especially when we think about how phasing something could work out and matching that timing. I see Bruce, your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I thought you were going to say something different, Logan, but you didn't, so I'll say it, which is that what we're talking about, everybody agrees that at the very least, wiring is so much cheaper and simpler to do when buildings are built. And I don't, off the top of my head, have any feel for the duration, the lifetime of multifamily buildings in Tucson, but my hunch is that it's more than 20 years. So I think what we're really looking at is what are things going to be like in the EV world, 15, 20, 30 years down the road. And that's the reason why I think it's super important to get the wiring in, and any other kind of inexpensive stuff. The plugs really cost like $50. So to me, it would be definitely looking backward, not forward, to have a very high percentage of new multifamily buildings and also new commercial operations have at least the infrastructure, because both the multifamily buildings and the commercial buildings are going to be around well past 2030. So if President Biden's idea is accomplished and if the trends continue, we want those buildings, whether they're 5 years old or 10 years old, to be ready to handle a lot of these EVs. I think are very likely to be there. So I think it's the long lifespan of buildings that makes it even more imperative to have an ambitious plan now, not a overly cautious plan that would be more expensive and less likely to be able to pull off, 8, 10, 12, 15 years down the road when we really need it more.
Yeah, and commenting on that, I think I agree with you completely. I guess what I was thinking is more of the wiring that would be retroactively difficult. Maybe the wiring is in place, but we don't put the facilities because of your comment on how maintaining the EV charging stations, if they're put in and not used for 10 years, what would that do? But maybe, yeah, the inexpensive wiring and the planning ahead, I think that could be like completely viable. And then they could just add the stations as they have more electric parking requirements.
When we're talking about, this is Marilyn, about having the infrastructure in for future setups for the charging stations, I'm wondering if what thinking is going on about connecting for solar. It would seem to me that we're talking about these charging stations that we should be talking about equipping them with solar access, solar panels. Is that being considered?
I can't speak specifically to the direct connection from solar facilities to the charging stations, but considering the capacity of the grid is an important component. Thank you so much for everything that people are contributing here. I do want to keep an eye on the time. I also see that a few hands have been up for a little bit. So I'd like to give Antonio a chance to speak, and then Camila, and then we might consider moving on to the restaurant expansion after that, if that's okay. Antonio.
Yeah, I had just questions a little bit more about the cost, but not just the cost to install the EV stations, but what's the cost for like a parking lot in general, or like one parking stall? How much does that cost to do in Tucson? And how does that cost compare to the cost of building an EV station? And another part of that is how do the incentives to reduce parking and the cost for that compare to the construction of parking at the base requirements without doing the reduction? Like, is there really a benefit to not to take up that incentive, or yeah, how does that all work?
Right, it's a tricky balance because you can kind of price it out per space, and then depending on the size of each development, it can be quite wide ranging. My understanding is that a basic parking space is in the hundreds, and that kind of matches the cost of wiring. Once you get up to installing the stations, those are a few $1,000s each, maybe 5,000 per station. So there is quite a big jump from capable up to the EV stations, but there's a smaller jump from adding just the ready plugs to something that is wired. So the bigger jump happens from EV ready up to the stations. And I'll give Camila
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I know the first part of the question was, what's the cost for a regular parking lot or a parking station? Like without Eevee, like scratch that, just like for a development to do each stall, what's the cost for that? Or I'm sure it's a range depending if it's a parking garage, but curious.
Sure. Yeah, my understanding is in the range of a few $100s, even just for a paved parking space. Parking is expensive for developers, and when there's opportunities to provide fewer of them, sometimes it can be really advantageous. I'll give Camila a chance to speak, and then I would like to move us to the restaurant expansion part of our discussion.
Great, thank you so much. I tend to agree that we need a lot more data in terms of what would be the cost differential before we can kind of opine on which route to take. I do generally agree with Bruce that what we're looking at is really setting something up for the future. And so at a minimum, definitely the pre-wiring requirement for new development would be a way to ensure that we kind of have at least the baseline infrastructure in place. With changes in technology and, you know, battery sizes as it, you know, continues to develop, you know, those things might, customer wishes around the speed of charging might change. So you have to consider that in terms of what wiring you're talking about. But I agree that we definitely need to start kind of planning for the future on that case. And then I just wanted to touch on Marilyn's point regarding solar and the coupling of solar with EV charging stations. I think that is a great solution for certain use cases. When you're talking about the level 3 chargers, that becomes kind of a little bit of a challenge because of the amount of power that they use to charge the vehicles would require a really, 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 really large solar array. You know, we're talking chargers that are 50 kW, 150 kW, all the way up to 300 kW. And so that some of those things aren't quite compatible with, you know, the site, but I think in the use cases where it makes sense, it's definitely something that we could, that we should look at. And those are the balance of my comments. Thanks.
Great. Thank you again, everybody, for your comments there. We will move on to the second half of tonight. Loud and clear that we need more data and information on cost. So that is something that we are working on to kind of match numbers to those scenarios that we're talking about. As we gather more information, we are going to be updating our website. If you've got more comments on this topic that you weren't able to express tonight, you could add them into the chat box as we go. You can also follow up by email, and we'll make sure that my email is available to you. So thank you for that. We will shift over to restaurant expansions now. Some photos to kind of set the scene. These are examples throughout the country and here in Tucson, where you can see that the ability for bars and restaurants to expand into their parking areas was a program response to the pandemic, a relief to struggling businesses, restaurants, bars, using their location to add more outdoor seating, using different chairs, tables, and elements to transform those areas into appealing and comfortable places to gather and eat and socialize. And so just to touch on the timeline of this program, it started as the city's response to the pandemic as social distancing guidelines were put into place. In May 2020, an emergency declaration was made, which included relaxed zoning rules that made these quick and temporary expansions possible. Over a year later, in August of this year, we're still living with pandemic precautions. And this program has been a success for a number of reasons. The mayor and city council extended the program and instructed city staff in a few different departments to develop a permanent version of the program. So this outdoor seating can be continued to be used. So this meeting tonight is part of our team's outreach, our info gathering. This plus additional research will inform a proposal that will take to mayor and council this winter and early next year as hopefully something that can be used long-term. And I'll just take a second to clarify. You may have seen a few different designs and configurations for these outdoor seating areas around town. Tonight, we're specifically speaking about the seats that have been placed on private property, most likely parking lots. The other configuration might be a little bit more visible. It's got a little more coverage in the media. It's likely in areas like downtown and 4th Avenue, where seating has been placed on the sidewalk or in the street. Those are, we're calling streeteries. They're in the public right of way. They are in areas where there aren't very many surface parking lots. They're already in a more pedestrian friendly setting. Speed limits are lower. And ultimately on the paperwork side of things, it's the Department of Transportation and Mobility that will develop and run that program because they have jurisdiction over the right of way. The parking lot patios that we're talking about tonight are in places where perhaps the speed limit is too high to put seating in the roadway. There are often surface parking lots or a little bit more area that can be utilized. So our team, Planning and Development Services, will develop and run this program because of its effects on zoning regulations. So that's our focus tonight. And here on this map of Tucson, you can see there's been interest in this program in many areas throughout the city. These dots represent locations that have taken part in this temporary program. It does show those right-of-way streeteries as well as the parking lot patios. The split across the program is almost half and half. Though we know from context, those clusters there, downtown and 4th Avenue, are going to be those streetery examples. But the patio expansions have been applied for and placed in lots of areas throughout the city. So even in this temporary program, there are a number of requirements for these seating areas. For example, they cannot block or replace ADA parking or access. They can't impede emergency access or safe movement for drivers or pedestrians. They need to be safely separated from parking and moving cars. And if applicable, they may be subject to review by Tucson Fire as well as any liquor license requirements. And just some breakdown in the applications to the program. Here we are just looking at those parking lot patio sites. Most of the 21 applicants, 16 of them actually, are repurposing parking spaces in their parking lots to provide that outdoor seating. These added seats are, based admittedly on a pretty quick application process, and they showed a range of seating configurations. But most of these locations have used about 5 parking spots per location. And on average, they've added about 9 seats per parking space. Down at the bottom of the screen, 5 applicant sites have had the room available to add seating without affecting their parking areas. Sometimes they've added elements that allow comfortable access on their landscaping areas or on-site walkways, or just extra space on site. So each location could have different circumstances, different context to design around, and there's been some creative ways to match what they have to work with. And we found that people have enjoyed them. Based on outreach that the Department of Transportation and Mobility conducted, they were able to survey 250 people, and almost half of the people they spoke to thought being able to visit a restaurant with outdoor seating was extremely important. And 44% thought it was somewhat important. A majority of people surveyed would like to see outdoor dining continue even after the pandemic. And 83 of those surveyed thought using parking spaces to do that was a good idea. So following up on this, our team is conducting surveys specifically with restaurants and bars, those who have and have not used the program. We're trying to better understand the benefits and if there are any barriers to success. So we're working on getting that feedback now, and that's something that we'll report back on later. Because if the program is to be continued, there are a few things that we'll have to work out. One aspect is that currently bars and restaurants have some of the highest parking requirements based on the current code. Every site could be different, but when the relaxed zoning from the emergency declaration ends, some sites that expanded their square footage may not have the needed parking spaces that match that new footprint. And as we saw, most places have actually used parking spaces to expand that square footage. So they're kind of chipping away at those required spots from both sides. There's a few things that could happen. Maybe some locations that expanded don't want to continue. They're happy taking the seating away when the temporary program ends, but other places have really benefited from the program and want to continue. Some places may not have gotten the chance to try the program out and want to. So we're looking for the right balance and right program to allow for a long-term version of the patio expansions. One idea, because it is a program that already exists, is to utilize what's called the individual parking plan. So this is an application to provide, for a site to provide fewer parking spaces than is required by the zoning code. It's super site specific. It's not a blanket waiver across the city. It requires notification and neighborhood meetings if the site is within our 1, 2, and 3 zones. And there's a number of components to that application. An applicant needs to provide an existing and a proposed site plan. ADA spaces, again, cannot be reduced or blocked. The application requires traffic counts and a circulation study, notification, as I mentioned, and proposals, strategies for how noise, vehicle access, and neighborhood parking will be mitigated. As part of the application, maybe the applicant will promote alternate transportation, rideshare, all those options, as well as perhaps a shared parking agreement with adjacent sites. For example, maybe the restaurant is next to a hardware store that closes up right as dinner time hits. And if it's agreed upon, that parking can be used by the restaurant to meet that need. So all those details would need to be presented in an application, proposed at the relevant neighborhood meetings, case by case. But the conflict here is that this program is not currently allowed for restaurants and bars unless they're a part of mixed use. So one option is to allow bars and restaurants to make their case for reduced parking by just adding the IPP to the patio expansion application if needed. So one way this could work, to break it down, is that a bar and restaurant first has to consider their existing occupancy thresholds. They need to look at the square footage they take up now, what adding more room would do for their restroom and fire code thresholds. If the numbers come out that expanded seating is feasible based on the resources on site, they would start to look at their location and decide where extra seating could go. Maybe they have walkways, maybe they only have a parking lot, but there's enough spaces to work with and meet their minimum parking spaces. Then if parking isn't affected, they could proceed with just the site plan, the patio expansion application. But if their design results in less than the minimum spaces, in this scenario, they would apply for the individual parking plan, the IPP, in addition to the expansion application. So as I said, it's a program that already exists. It may or may not be needed depending on the restaurant characteristics, but it does have several checks and balances along the way. So in discussing the patio expansion program, we'd like to hear about what's worked and what's been challenging and what could help a successful continuation of it. So again, know that you can unmute yourself or you can utilize the chat function. And we'll start off with anybody who has participated in the expansion program, either from the restaurant side, from a visitor side or from the neighborhood side, what has been your experience, best practices, or other takeaways?
I would just like to go back to that page where they talked about the existing businesses and how many parking spaces they have removed to add what kind of seating at the restaurants. I've been to, I think I was at Casa Video. I think that one they added like 24 seats instead of 7 cars or something. And so, or 28 seats instead of 6 cars. I think that's kind of ridiculous. Like, we want the sales taxes. We want people to be enjoying businesses. And most of our parking in our city is very underutilized. I think there are like 8 parking spaces per car in the country. I think this is a pretty non-conversation in a lot of context.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty striking. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've been to Royal Room, I've been to Prep and Pastry, I've been to 1912 Brewing, I've been to Surly Winch, I've been to Casa Video, and like, of course, it's lovely being outside, and it's, should there be 6 Honda Civics there, or should there be 28 people there? Like, of course, we want the sales tax, we want the enjoyment. Like, this just feels like an easy one for me. I don't know how everybody else feels. I'm like, in our neighborhood, we have our permitted parking requirements, and that turns into Park Tucson funds, which we've used to fund speed humps and things like that. So if somebody has an issue, they can add, I don't know. It just feels like there are like layers to deal with this if parking is an issue, unless somebody else has something very much against removing parking spaces to add seating.
I have a question about the Parkwise parking permits. Are those purchased by the property owner? We have a lot of rental housing along Speedway, just in from Speedway in our neighborhood. But if those are renters, what's the situation with Parkwise and getting those permits?
That's an interesting crossover there. I think we'd have to get the details from somebody in our Park Tucson department. But yeah, I follow what you're bringing up there.
Thank you.
In our neighborhood, it's generally paid for by the residents, or whoever wants a permit, they pay for that permit. So your neighborhood could apply to make an area of the neighborhood permit required. I assume, is that correct? Does anybody else have experience with that?
I believe that you need to have 60% of a block of individuals to get a individual parking plan for that block. It can be a little troublesome to try to actually get the people to be involved, but it's up to the individuals.
But can it be by renters, or does it have to be the property owner?
That I can't answer.
This is Courtney. Yeah, tenants can purchase those parking passes. Anyone who's a resident of the neighborhood can purchase the pass. And in fact, if they want to park on the street, they're required to have a parking permit.
Great, that's helpful. Thanks for bringing up that program. I'll go back over to the question slide here. If there are kind of the other side of the issue, if there has been issues, if anybody would like to bring them up, and if there are additional ideas like these other parking programs that could complement a program and make this work, kind of resolving those issues, if you've got suggestions.
I have to admit, this is Martha McClements talking. I enjoy the outdoor dining, and I guess my concern is I'd say put them in the street. I don't like the public sidewalks being blocked off for private use. There are a couple of examples on either side. but I think it works better if the seating is out using one of the parking spaces as opposed to blocking the sidewalk. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Beth Grindell. At the last time we discussed this, a couple of restaurant owners at least brought up the issue of whether it was worthwhile going into this when a lot of people feel that there's really only 5 or 6 months a year that are useful for outdoor dining. And how do you factor that into consideration of whether this is worth doing? And are you considering that?
Yes, absolutely. I mentioned the survey that we've sent out to restaurants and the amount of time or the part of the year that's appealing is part of our questions to them. So far, it's been half and half. People say just seasonally works, but there's been a few responses that all year is appealing. So we're still waiting to get some more responses on that.
Thank you.
Do we have any more thoughts on how a program like this can best benefit Tucson? There's a few different stakeholders, players to keep in mind in each situation.
I think that there are a few friends who have tried to open patios, but they've had trouble, like Sarah's Pasta and La Cocina or Anello, where the fire department will not let people add patios because of road width or different issues like that. I don't know. I think this just needs to be like a top-down approach because it seems like it still is outrageously difficult and daunting, and most restaurants say they're not willing to approach it because the time requirements are so high. So I'd rather see like more parking requirements reduced and make this process as easy as possible so that people can access it. Because if like well-resourced restaurants are having trouble doing this, then like what is an unresourced restaurant without the knowledge or communication? How are they going to do it on like South 6th Avenue or South 12th Avenue? Like, where are they getting resources? Where are they getting information?
Yeah, that's a great point. The program should be equitable and accessible for as many sites as possible. Are there any thoughts on what kind of resources might help the program be as equitable as possible?
Okay, so I wanted to mention that it may be possible where there's density of restaurants and bars, like along Speedway on the south edge of Glen Elm, that if the businesses could join together in some kind of a business improvement district, they could have some joint parking facilities. One of the businesses on Speedway has closed down, and the restaurants around there are now using their parking, which makes it really nice for them. I think that's how Casa Film Bar is able to have their food trucks come in to their parking lot because they have adjacent vacant building with the parking available there. And at one point when they widened Speedway, they did tear down some buildings and created parking lots. They also closed streets. They closed Forges at Helen to create more parking. So I think maybe that could be looked at as some kind of a business improvement district that would make it possible for more of them to expand outdoor seating and provide the parking.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have thoughts on the topic of seasonality? Any other challenges? Any other successes they've seen?
This is Barbara. I guess going back to parking permits or parking obstruction, I'd call it, in neighborhoods is a problem. If you're going someplace and you need to be in that neighborhood, it's sometimes very, very difficult to find any place to park, blocks away even. I don't know what we do about that, but when all those signs are cropping up all over over town and neighborhoods, it's hard. It's hard to get to where you're trying to go.
Thank you. Okay, I want to give the space for anybody else who has follow-up comments. It's also possible to type them into the chat box there. And as I mentioned before, for the Eevee part of the evening, you can follow up with email. I'll go ahead and wrap up this discussion now and just put a timeline back on the screen for you to see where we're at tonight. And on Wednesday, we're doing the same presentation, but in person, is part of our public meetings and our outreach as we look to draft proposals in both of these topic areas over the next few months, with the goal of presenting to Planning Commission and Mayor and Council with potential code amendments at the beginning of next year. The webpage that we're using to provide updates and more information is there at the bottom of the screen. We are on the hook to provide you more information on costs, especially in the Eevee discussion. And as I mentioned, we're working on that survey with restaurant and bar owners. So those are some things to look forward to as we put these proposals together. I want to thank you so much for spending your Monday evening with us. Really appreciate you taking the time and providing your feedback. And as I mentioned, you can follow up with more information at our website. And I thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.